Welcome everybody to Capes and Scowls West. The trade paperback spectacular. I am one of your hosts, Nat, and with me as always,
Cat in a Hat.
And Pat with no hat.
And today we have a special guest. We have Griffin Games and Comics trade paperback graphic novel expert,
Spectacular.
Kim.
Hi.
So this is actually one of our mini-sodes. We're going to go ahead and do kind of our top 3 each trade paperbacks of all time. I want to do a little bit of like.
Let's let there might be manga in there. There might be.
Well,
I don't know who would do that.
I want to talk about a little bit of a preface of this. In trade paperback, we literally mean anything that could have been published solely as a graphic novel, a collection of individual comic books, or a collection of manga or a specific manga volume. So we are looking at basically the broad spectrum, and yeah, so.
So our favorite thick comic books of all time.
Pretty much. Who wants to get started? We didn't really think about that.
I mean, I could go first since I only have technically one actual comic on here.
Alright, well, let's hear it.
Which is the funniest part because it's not even a DC one.
What? Is it Disney?
It's not Disney
Okay.
either. It's Image.
What?
Alright.
Oh,
Let's
because
hear it.
someone was
I
gracious
don't
enough.
understand where she's going with this.
The Walking Dead. The first giant, I always say this wrong, and Nat normally has to pronounce it for me, so the first compendium, because
Compendium.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Every time, and I know it, I say it right in my head, and then it doesn't come out that way. But anyways, the first one, because one, more bang for your buck. I'm just saying, like, there's 48 issues in here. The first 48 issues of The Walking Dead.
It's like 6 volumes.
That's a lot
I
of
think,
comics.
if I remember correctly, it said 8.
Yeah.
So either way.
So why specifically do you like the first 48 issues of The Walking Dead, Cat?
Specifically because, number one, the show sucks in comparison. It sucks. Everybody can get mad and angry at me all you want, but until you read the comic, shut up.
We are throwing shade today.
Oh my gosh.
We all know I'm not nice. I don't hide it. But the first 48 issues is, it's a lot darker, you see more, yes, the world is over. Woo. I like the fact that there's a lot more psychological elements to it, and you actually see that it's actually harming children too, growing up in this world. And you see that within this first book.
Oh my god, you see it a lot in that first book.
One of the
I
things,
think, if I remember correctly too, like, there's like a giant, people die, like, nobody is safe. No one, nothing is safe, and I don't want to tell anybody anything because I would actually like you to read it, but no one is safe. Everybody is like, you're on the chopping block. It doesn't matter. In the show, I feel like there are some people who are not, they can't kill. In this one, there's days where I'm like, I don't know if you're gonna live. But
one of the things that I noticed, just like flipping through it and having read, I probably only read like the first 3 volumes of Walking Dead way back in the day. And it's the artistic change. When you're going from Tony Moore to Charlie Adler, you actually get to see it in this compendium, which is really interesting to me because, you have, and it's funny that Kirkman has this sort of history, is starting a book with one artistic creator who helped shape what the book is, but then the book completely becomes the other artists. Like, it is, Charlie Adler is so associated with Walking Dead that I'm not even sure what else he's done. Like, his art is so like ingrained in what the visual imagery of Walking Dead is.
It makes me so happy. It took me days to read this. And
Days?
It
Oh,
did.
Jesus Christ.
It's
a long time to read.
it's huge.
Why is that fast?
That's fast for me. I'm like, I am a slow reader.
I read really
I get
quickly, and
that.
it took me days to read this, and I finished it, and I was like, I need the second one! And now this is the only way I read them, because...
Because it's painful. It's kind of painful to sometimes to try and keep up with it issue by issue.
Well, yeah, the other part of it is like, look at this. There's 3 of these! There's going to be a 4th, I believe, soon, because I think they're hitting that mark right about now since the last one, but... Like,
Just broke some eardrums.
Yeah.
Back right there.
Yeah.
Sorry,
That was
those
it,
are
like-
headphones.
You can't see me wave, I feel bad.
I'm really concerned about the Witchblade issue #1 that just got demolished by that compendium.
Oh no, the white knight was there too.
That's why we still have the variant cover.
It's true, I still have two. It's alright. I'm still sad about it. But I mean, it's also a convenient paperweight and, self-defense.
Yeah, right? Be able to beat somebody with your comic books.
Which is
That's
kind of
awesome.
aqueduct. Yeah.
Throw it at the zombies and they'll eat
Yeah,
it.
there you go. Yeah, they can get their brains from this. There's some good vocabulary in there. I don't know.
That's awesome.
Low
That's awesome.
jokes today, I'm sorry.
Low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
You know what? I'll go ahead and jump in next, and I will talk about my number 3, which, because obligatory Batman book. Why not? Batman: Dark Victory, written by Jeff Loeb, art by Tim Sale.
I would just like to point out how nicely yellowed the page
Yeah, this is
That's
beat up.
vintage, man.
That-
Clearly an old copy.
This is DC Comics logo from
Oh, snap.
2 logos ago. So yeah, this is an older copy of this book. Artistic influence is always going to be a driving force for me, and I had never.
That Catwoman was awesome looking.
Yeah,
Look in there.
she's totally. Well, Tim Sale's design sense, and I had a discussion with Patrick about this as we talked about our comic book, is that it's almost Batman from the lens of a 10-year-old child looking up. So all of the characters are
looking at this panel, I can see
super heightened. The story is a sequel. A lot of people prefer Long Halloween. I like Dark Victory because it is the villain parade. You really get to see Two-Face. You get to see Joker, and there's a lot of turns. And one of the things I think this book does incredibly well is Robin. You get the introduction of
Which
Dick
Robin?
Grayson.
Okay.
This is it's basically
Like, which
Batman
one?
year 3, I guess, would be like the best time frame to put it in. It's very classic. It is very dark, and it deals with
Dark Victory, dark.
right, exactly. It deals with the Hangman Killer, who everybody's kind of assuming that it's just going to be a rehash of Holiday, who's the killer in The Long Halloween, but there's some family elements. It introduces elements into the origin of Catwoman.
Huh.
It's been the inspiration, or it's part of the inspiration for the Batman Begins Dark Knight universe that was created by Chris Nolan. There's so much of just Batman when you read this. It just feels so pure. It has that 1920s, 1940s vibe. It's just awesome, and it's one of those things. It's easy to read. It's violent. It's just everything I love about Batman.
I'd like to point out you said violence. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
What?
I mean, look at like super
Batman is
cool
violent.
Dick Grayson as the little kid in his proto suit, just kicking some ass.
Is that a bat?
I
That's
think
not a
it's just
bat.
like-
I don't know.
No.
I think it's just a stick that's like a staff, probably something that he was training with. So yeah, if you haven't read the Jeff Loeb Tim Sale partnership, and you're a Batman fan, you're doing yourself a disservice. This is really one of the
You have to
great.
get accustomed to that artwork.
I don't know. I think it's
I always have to get myself in the right mindset.
See, and for me, it's just automatically appealing. I think it's different. It doesn't look like what you see on comic book shelves normally. There's no real Tim Sale is Tim Sale. You'll see Tim Sale's art and know that. And I think for me, that is what I look for. I
feel
want
like
to be able
this
to
is a little.
pinpoint
I feel
that.
like it's a little gritty. I can't say that I like Dick Grayson's.
Well, he's a kid. I mean, he's
Very much.
legitimately a child in this. This is his. You see the death of his parents. You see Dick Grayson's origin as part of this story.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Am
love
I
it.
up
I think you're up.
Yeah, I think
On
you're
the
up.
part of
I guess that's the order we're going in.
part of the circle? Mine are not in any particular order because I didn't do that. So we're gonna start with this one. Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud.
So
I've actually read a little bit of that too.
So good. This man has not, because he is the worst comics manager ever.
What?
See,
We
that's the
are
kind of-
throwing
See,
shade.
that's the kind of shade that's not necessary right now.
Oh, man.
So this book changed how I read other books.
Mhm.
In addition, not just how I read comics, but how you read virtually anything, how you read advertising, how you read just like the language of images, which I had never really thought about. And
How
it's
you look at it.
possible.
How you look at a piece of art.
Yeah,
in
how you
general.
kind of look at things. This changed how I do that. It's possible that you have not read this and you don't like it because you have this visual training already.
That
It's
that would
still
be.
stupid.
I was like, you know what? We almost came out of that hole.
So my major problem with this is I don't like Scott McCloud's art, and as we've established before, I am an art guy. It's not appealing to me. It's newspaper comic strip, which has its own place. I'm not saying that that's not warranted, just not my taste. The other thing is I went into this book not really knowing its importance, and I see the name Understanding Comics and went, oh, okay, so this is going to be something that I can refresh, panel layout, and this will be something that's great for new people. If you don't know how to read comics, this is impossible to read. You have to have that basis first. So I felt like it was false advertising. Like I'm looking at Understanding Comics going, wait a minute.
It's comics theory.
This
Right.
is a textbook
Yes.
written in panel layout.
Yeah.
Yes.
And knowing that now, I will give it a second chance. because I
Whatever. You're
understand
never getting my
some
copy ever again because you did not properly respect it.
Wow.
Done.
Wow.
So Kim, what are some of your favorite parts of Understanding Comics? If you had a particular favorite chapter per se or something like that.
I go back and I read like chapters. So chapter 2, right, the vocabulary
Mm-hmm.
is a really important one. It's also huge. But I mean, even I will see this sitting on my shelf and I will just randomly open up to like a random page and just read a few pages and go, oh yeah, that's right. Brilliant!
So is this not meant to be read linear, or like is it?
No, I think that the reason that I can do that with it is because I've read it many times.
Okay.
Right?
So
Because I can
each
just sort of drop myself back in there.
Each chapter of this basically takes a different stance. Like 1 is the history, 2 is the vocabulary. There's a chapter about colors. There's a chapter about like time.
There's a chapter about colors in a black and white book.
Yeah. Well, that's the only chapter that's in color.
What? Show me this.
There's a chapter about the gutter. There's a whole chapter just about the gutter.
It might not be in color in mine, actually.
Oh, and
Dun, dun,
Mine is
dun.
super
Dun, dun, dun,
old.
dun.
Dun, dun,
in
dun.
mine it's actually in color, but that might be a different printing.
Yeah, this
Interesting.
one's really old.
So
185.
yeah, it's great. If
Oh,
you
look, there it is. No,
Oh,
it
there
is.
you go. Oh, sweet.
It is.
Color
You're right.
theory.
Look, there's Mobius.
See, I would actually like to read this chapter because color theory in school was rough. It
yeah,
was a rough chapter for
it's
artistic
none
training.
of it's
In the back of my
dense.
mind, I'm like, and this is why Kat's going to be a logistics analyst because she can only understand that. They're like creative theory. Here you go.
Yeah.
A word about color.
A word about color.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yep.
I was hoping the word was going to be in color, but you know, whatever.
Too cheeky, maybe. Like that. It's too on the nose, as they say.
Still, anyway, so good. Everyone should read it.
Okay, so I was about to say, who did we recommend? The Understanding Comics.
It is not
to?
for people who
yeah.
are just getting into comics.
No.
It is for people who have been introduced to the genre already
Yes.
and know about it and want to understand.
In addition to
Define
that,
no.
right? There's a certain type of nerd which is going to be more interested in this, and it's like it's a theoretical nerd, right? It's
Mhm.
a person who, right?
Basically, if you are
My
if you're a
literary theory
thinker-
class was one of my favorite classes.
Mm-hmm.
So
Like-
if it's one of those things, I mean, I guess, because we sit and analyze comics all the time, so I feel like for all of us, it'll probably be an easier thing to do. But
Mm-hmm.
I think if it's more, I'm guessing, what I'm assuming is, I haven't read it, so I don't know. I have to read it. I don't have time for anything. Anyways, if you like to analyze and overthink things, I'm guessing this would probably be right up someone's alley.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
This
But
should
I
not be the.
proved that is not necessarily the case.
This should not
but you have a
be.
specific, you have a different reason.
True.
Right?
You're already
You
big.
looked at it and you
Uh-huh.
said, I don't like this particular thing about it, and I have to get past that thing in order to.
True.
in
And
order
you're
to
also
get-
This should not
You're
be the
also
first
visually
trade
trained.
paperback
Yeah.
that you read.
No.
This should not be the first trade
No.
paperback that
No.
you read.
Read The Walking
It should
Dead!
be, it should be the fourth.
Right?
Actually, wait, no, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I take my
At
recommendation
least
back?
the
I just
fourth.
thought about that. Don't do that. Read something happy first.
Don't read The Walking Dead first.
Maybe we should read Patrick's pick first, right?
Yes.
Well, should
Your
I
turn.
start with my first ever graphic novel since we just mentioned that?
Sure.
Even though it's not my third favorite, it's my second favorite of
Okay.
all time. We'll do it a little bit out of order. This is Watchmen by Alan Moore with art by Dave Gibbons. This is the first ever graphic novel that I ever read. I was in high school, and it was a summer reading option, actually.
He's got the yellow pages
on
going
my
on that one too.
Yes, I have the
I
yellow pages.
honestly did break out my
'Cause
Watchmen copy and like.
I've owned this
notes.
for probably close to 10 years at this point. This book is amazing. Once again, unless you're really like me and you just love like reading things that make you like hate your life and the world around you, then this should also not be the first comic book that you read.
What is wrong with all of us?
I'm very
Mine was
surprised
new
that was the
reader
first one
friendly.
that you ever read.
So if you are not
He
familiar
reads
with
Bitch Planet though. Like dude's always been dense.
Yeah.
That
you-
sounded bad.
so
I will let myself out.
So if you are not familiar with the storyline of Watchmen, it takes place during the Cold War. There is a group of superheroes called the Watchmen who are...
The Minutemen.
Oh, the Minutemen, yes, because the Watchmen was the previous group.
No,
And-
there's no.
The
So there's a
Minutemen.
funny thing. There's no one ever called the Watchman.
true.
The Watchman is a term
It's
used
just-
for the government,
It's
for
just the
superheroes,
graffiti that you
for
see on the
anyone
wall.
in power. It's who watches the Watchman.
That's true. I forget this. So there's a group of superheroes called the Minutemen who are based. They go around fight crime and capes and whatnot, and none of them have superpowers except for Dr. Manhattan,
Who comes
is,
on the scene later.
Yes, who comes on the scene much later, and he is God.
Yeah.
His superpower is to control things at an anatomical level, or
And
at
Atomical
atomical level. Excuse me.
Anatomically correct atomic level.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Pull
So-
things apart that look the way they're supposed to be.
So he
My eyes might start
is.
bleeding.
So he is the only thing that is basically keeping Russia from attacking the United States during the Cold War, because if Russia attacks the United States, he'll just remove Russia from existence, and there will just be a white space on the map.
Yep.
And
What was that?
Um,
Let's not talk about it.
yeah. So except
You
for
will
the
never
fact
know.
except for the fact that at one point he just leaves, and so the world kind of goes to shit. This book is so dense as well. Like there's just so much going
I
on.
have to reread it for
And
Doomsday
each
Clock.
I know.
after
same
each
thing.
Posting of that.
after each chapter we get like fake like letters and newspaper clippings and textbooks that just give you more about the world that it's in, not even the plot. We have like the question of what is justice, and is it right to kill 3 million people to save 3 billion people, or is it like just like
Save the many or save the few.
this is basically the psychology of superheroes.
Yeah.
In this whole thing, it takes your favorite superheroes, or at the time I read this, I had such a vague understanding of superheroes. It takes the idea of people who go out and just punch the shit out of other people with their bare fists and asks the question why.
Yes.
Why do they punch the shit
You
out
know
of
what?
people?
Just
What
honestly,
hell
the
is
fact
wrong
that
with
you
them?
read
because something is wrong.
Yeah.
the fact that
actually
he read
not
this
normal.
first probably explains all of your comics
Yeah.
like, to a
I was
T.
as he was talking about that, I was thinking about the fact that like this probably had that seminal formation of the superhero to Patrick. So there's like this distaste for that type of hero that
Yeah.
has sort of
So
naturally
I don't-
developed from that.
I
And then
think
you
you're
have
absolutely right.
yeah.
I've never thought about that because I've never liked the bubblegum sort of superheroes
Right.
that just go out and punch people for
Right.
America.
It's
I've
like
always
Me and
wanted-
Matt sit over here, and me and my Superman
I
hat, him
want-
as Batman.
I want I want the comedian. I want Rorschach. I want all of the heroes to be Silk Spectre. I want Superman to be Dr. Manhattan.
Which also like is why you actually have positively gravitated towards White Knight is like it's
Yeah.
the broken
Yep.
idea.
Yeah, exactly. It's not this. Yeah, it just asks, and not only does it ask the question of how do superheroes think, but it also asks the question of how do people think in general. And it doesn't just ask the question of why do superheroes exist. It asks the question of why do we exist? And
God is Blade Runner all over again.
I know. This is basically like the superhero version of Blade Runner.
Oh
my
God.
I could go on forever. Watchmen, amazing.
This is an interesting, like, this Watchmen might be unique, and I think that might be the only book here that all of us have read.
It's been a long time, so
We'll
it's like
see.
pulling.
We should reconvene at the end.
Yeah.
Well,
It's been a long time though. Like we're talking. How old am I?
I don't
It's
know.
it's been a bit, so it's like I have to, and it's one of those things. If I just read it, I can't say that I necessarily absorbed what I read either. It was one of those of
You can also, I mean, that one is tricky because you can
Yeah.
read it at several different levels.
Yeah.
You can
Yes.
go through and you can just read the comics and not read any of the text in the back, and you're fine. You
That's what I
understand
did.
happened.
That's what I
That's-
did the first
yeah.
time I read
Yeah.
it through, and
Yeah.
then
And then the next time you go through and you're like, oh my God, look at all this other stuff.
Yeah,
And
that's the
honestly,
thing,
all
it's
it
like-
really does is make me want to go back too when I think about it and look through the Cold War because that's one of the ones where I feel like if you know the history better, it makes me feel like Animal Farm. If you know the history better, you see more and understand more. So that's like the other part of it is I'm like I feel like now I need like once I read it, I'm like I don't remember.
Well, and it's a funny thing for me with Watchmen is once again going back to being an art guy. Dave Gibbons has a perfect panel layout and like characterization. Everybody looks different. It's not appealing to me. It is a book that I've read because of what it is for comic books, less about something that I
I've also
personally
heard,
enjoy.
I've also heard that
Artistically,
the
it has
author
not
himself
aged
is
well.
No, it hasn't, and it's a product of the '80s, and it
It
feels
is.
like a product of the '80s.
heard the
Although, I
author
mean-
is very interesting in himself.
Alan
and-
Moore.
Yeah.
What you mean by
Yeah.
interesting is freaking crazy,
Yeah.
right?
That's essentially what I
yes.
meant.
Alan
Because
Moore,
apparently
while
he-
being an amazing writer, is probably the most egotistical
Yeah.
person writing comics ever.
Well, and it's hard like it's
I
hard
feel
to
like I've heard
separate.
he separate. Like I've heard he. Someone told me that the god he worships is like a snake god from like the 7th century.
Yeah, it's
I
like
would not surprise
he's
me at
like
all.
a warlock now. Like, he writes comics and practices, magic. So.
Yeah.
And not like the cards, because I do that.
But apparently, whatever he's doing is working because this book is on the New York Times 100 best books of all time.
But to be
Yeah.
fair, it's been there for like years.
Yeah, it's
right?
still-
This came out forever ago.
It's
Yeah.
still
I
nice.
am not as into his more recent stuff. I don't
Yeah.
like it.
I mean,
He-
it
he's-
might be because as time
he's
has
kind
gone
of-
on, he got more money and things are a little odd.
Well, and also
Sorry,
no one
sorry
will
if
work
you're
with
listening,
him
Alan
because
Moore,
he's
but
crazy.
he's kind of disappearing up his own asshole.
Yeah. I mean, no one is gonna say, Alan Moore, you're a terrible writer.
No.
Well, people are just gonna be like,
Alan
this dude's
Moore,
weird.
he's past his prime.
He's past his prime.
Done his thing.
But there's a lot of creators, yeah.
But the stuff that he did,
yeah.
fucking amazing.
It's
I
seminal
don't know
work.
what our rating is. Sorry.
Oh, it just fits out
You
fine.
can, it's whatever.
Yeah. We can.
I'm here.
Yeah.
I know, but I haven't listened to you.
Ah!
Oh,
Give me
so much
Shade,
shade.
man. Like, what the heck?
You don't need to come back.
It's
It's
shade.
like,
I've been voted out.
it's like the invitation was a one-time only event.
Please tell our viewers, is shade your middle name?
It's not.
She's like, I thought about renaming it though. Don't
Alright,
worry about
so-
it.
Well, we can talk about
All right,
Watchmen a
we
lot.
should start
so,
again.
yeah.
Yep.
So what
Oh,
else
is
you
it
got
my
for us?
turn?
Yeah, it's your
Yeah.
turn.
Yes.
I'm gonna do the most surprising thing ever and talk about a manga. Like I know, like out of
What's
the
a manga? No, just kidding.
Well, let me inform you of.
I keep thinking my coffee's over here. I don't know why.
So, the next one that I'm gonna do, it's called Another. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the
Mhm.
series or read. It's actually started out as a book, funny enough.
A novel or like?
A novel. It was a
Interesting.
novel.
Okay.
Well, that's usually the creative process in Japan. It is a light novel, and then it's adapted into a manga, and then
But
it's
that's
adapted into an anime.
Yeah,
and then you get a
he's-
U.S. live-action movie.
He hit all key points. He's right. But no, I've read the novel. I read the novel first, and then I read the manga, and the manga is better. And it's also probably because it's easier to follow. It's one of the ones I had to do a spreadsheet for because I kept getting confused.
Okay.
Mostly because I couldn't follow what character was what, and I couldn't remember who was female and what was male, or who was male, Like I had to do blue and pink. It was pretty. Someone's gonna have to pronounce names for me too.
All right. So it's written by Yukito Ayatsui,
Yeah, I think it's a J.
and then Hiro Kiyohara would be the artist.
Thank you.
I hope I did that okay. Like,
You did it better than I would have. That's all that really matters. Because I would. Yeah, we would have been here a while. But the manga, just because the visuals help me, and this might just be because I'm American, so of course, like, Japanese names don't make sense to me, because I had it pointed out to me why I didn't understand it. Most female names end in a vowel, whereas male names end in a consonant, which I never knew or realized. Whereas in Japan,
all names.
Everything is like, everything ends in a vowel.
I got really confused there, and I thought we were talking about Japanese
No,
names.
it's
I was like going, I'm like, that doesn't seem right.
I literally just disproved
Yeah,
that.
right. So I was like,
no, it's yeah. So that was the one thing that I had a hard time with, is I couldn't keep track of who was female and who was male, and then having to keep track. There's a lot of characters.
Gotcha.
So it's trying to keep track of all of that is also it was very hard for me.
So aside from it being a confusing read, why is it?
Yeah.
Your favorite
What is it
manga?
anyway?
So it takes place in 1998. You meet Kochi, which I can never remember if I say his name right.
Right.
Yeah. So he ends up going to a new school in another town. He has a condition, I can't remember what it's called, but where his lung will collapse if he gets too nervous and there's too much, and his lung collapse. So when you first meet him, he's actually in the hospital. So he's going to a new middle school, and his mom's old town, his mother had passed away. So he's in the hospital, and he meets his class reps, and he doesn't really understand what's going on with them. They're acting slightly strange, and he's like, okay, I guess. Hi. It's basically that entire interaction. It's completely awkward, and you don't understand. So he starts going to school. He ends up going to school a week late because of what happened to him. So when he goes into class, he sees another student. Anyways, but it seems like no one else can see her. Like, she doesn't exist. So now you have this weird thing where he's like, am I crazy? No, am I crazy? But then you have students who are like, you shouldn't pay attention to things that aren't there. And the class that he's in has this weird quirk to it. And all of a sudden, one of his classmates dies after he's been paying attention to this girl. Her name is May. And she has an eye patch. It's weird. Anyways, it's not weird, but it's all very creepy, but not scary. And it's violent, but not gory. Like,
so what is the reason that
there's a quirk to this?
She's there? If you could
Spoiler.
Yeah.
Or maybe not like the reason, but what is like the message of
the
why
message
she's
is
there?
the message is don't pay attention to things that aren't there. Basically, follow the group, and when you stop following the group, there might be problems. And with a sudden classmate's death, that's when things start to take a turn for the worse, because that's when they realize you did this wrong and now we're all in trouble. So warning after warning, he ignores them, and it only leads into more questions because he doesn't understand what is going on. He's like, I don't get this. What's happening? What do you mean? Why? And then eventually it comes down to a point where he can't get any of his questions answered. It's really good. It's not like, it's one of those creepy ones where you're like, holy crap.
Yeah, it feels like the suspense is just in the story itself.
The entire story is built on suspense, and the thing is coming down. So I read the book, and then I picked up the manga. Reading the book, the book was really good. But going into the manga, I felt like it was just there was certain characters that were not brought in until later in the story, which didn't make sense because they ended up being this huge part to it. And then they weren't brought up until the end. So having that expanded some of the characters a little bit more, and of course the visual helped me understand who was who and keep everything straight because I got thought bubbles next to people, so that was also helpful in that effect. I'm not saying don't read the book, but the manga is much better because it's got a little more to it and the characters get a little more developed. And when you have a character who ends up being relatively important and they don't show up till like this much left of the book, then
then why
like
is
they
it-
show up, but they're not really anybody until then.
So I want to know why this is in your top 3.
Because-
you've told us a lot about the story,
Yeah.
which implies that it's a good story, and
Mhm.
okay, that's great. But
So
why does
top-
it mean something to you?
Top 3 wise is because I catch plot lines all the damn time. Every single time. It's very rare that I don't catch what they're gonna do. Even when some people are like, can you believe they did that? I'm like, I saw that from like 2 hours ago. Where were you at? This one actually caught me off guard. I was like, what? Like, it's one of the books it's very hard to catch me off guard with these kind of things. And that one did. I like, when I hit the end of the book and you hit the big climax, I was like, what? Like, I usually catch things relatively early. Like, I can't even tell you the countless movies where I'm like, saw that happening, knew that I still enjoy movies, but when they actually catch me off guard, I'm like, oh, all right. So that's why it ended up in the top 3 because of that thing exactly. Because I was caught off guard, I didn't know what to do with it, but I'm like, I can't stop.
It's something that just stuck with you.
Yeah.
The,
I mean,
the right amount of suspense.
Yeah, I
and-
have a bookcase full of manga, and it's sitting on the top shelf in the front. Like, it's also 2 books deep. So then that one's sitting in the very front, and it's like the entire story too. Because the one thing that does
Is it a single volume or is it multiple volumes?
yes, it is one volume. At least the way I bought it, it was in one volume. I don't actually know how it originally came out. I'm assuming it's chapters like everything else, but when I bought it, it's in that single volume, and it's harder for like it will come up like my top one is the one that kind of gets unfortunate because it's split into 2. So I had to pick between the 2, even though I like the entire story. It's this, yeah. So that's the kind of the crappy part to that with manga. A lot of times is you get split. So this one having it in a complete volume is really nice, and it's not a super long. You don't need a lot of history kind of deal. And that's the other thing is it's a nice read that I don't have to like. You delve into it, but I don't have to like sit and think about it either. It makes you think, but you're not like, you know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Alright.
That's prepping.
Yeah,
I'm
It is
prepping.
prepping.
Well,
that's
my
chopping
book
up a
is
bit
heavy.
already. Okay.
Oh, look, it's not The Walking Dead though. Don't worry,
No.
guys.
I,
And you won't drop it.
I have All-Star Superman as my number 2.
That's right, guys. You picked the Superman
I
one,
did.
not me.
I picked the Superman one, and mind you, it's above a Batman story.
Whoa.
So this is my absolute edition. So it's this beautiful, oversized slipcase version.
I
It
actually
has
kind of want to buy that.
one of my favorite images in comics ever. It's gonna
We'll
be
get
hard
to
see.
we'll get to things later.
For another issue, right?
I'll be salty.
So this is written by Grant Morrison and art by Frank Quitely, and quite frankly, Frank Quitely might be the best penciler inker in
Ew.
comics. I love
Okay,
Frank
never
Quitely.
mind.
Uh-oh.
Never mind. All right. not
You've
going
passed
there.
your shade level.
I meant,
today.
yeah, he's one of them. One of my absolute favorite.
I can't sassily hair flip, so I feel like we missed out on that sometimes.
But so this is the story of Superman on his deathbed. It's in the first issue. He is basically manipulated by Luthor into going into the sun, and what that does is it over-radiates his cells.
What? He's manipulated by Luthor?
I know, right?
The good-natured superhero manipulated? Oh my god!
So
As a
he,
Superman fan, I never saw it coming.
no, I'm shut up. I gotta talk here. Jesus Christ!
You started it.
So the premise is that his cells start to explode. So this is Superman with more power than he's ever had, and he's dying. So
His power's killing him.
yes, his power is killing him. So it is a retelling of the 12 labors of Hercules in Superman's world. So he goes through and he has to solve a riddle. He creates life. He figures out how to give superpowers to other people. It's this masterpiece journey of Superman. He gets to re-witness his father's death, but he gets to spend time with him as Superman without his father realizing it. It deals with
It is
identity.
quite pretty and big.
It is. It's beautiful. Frank Quitely's art is ugly. I'm gonna say that. Like there's something about like I put
I
Quitely
have
and
to ask, how does his dad die in this one? Because I've seen different renditions.
has a heart attack.
Okay, it is a heart
And
attack. All right.
he has a heart attack, and Superman's life, part of his time is eaten by the Chronivore, so he loses the minutes that he would need to save him.
Yeah.
So he tries, but he can't. He doesn't make it there. This is just like it's 12 issues combined into this just beautiful piece of art. It's Silver Age in the like weird sci-fi elements. It doesn't shy away from kind of the ridiculousness of Superman and how at his best he's a science fiction character. I think that's really what is missed a lot of the times. Do sci-fi stories, have weird aliens, have him be a scientist. He's a scientist's son. It's part of his lineage to
Well,
be
he's
the,
also what I don't think everybody realizes either. He's actually incessantly intelligent. Like that's why him
Exactly.
and Batman get along so well because Superman, intelligence-wise, is the one who can challenge him.
Oh yeah.
So you mentioned Silver Age. Do you know off the top of your head when this was published?
Well, this was like 2001.
Okay.
No, it's more recent than that. It's probably 2010.
It's okay. I was just
yeah,
curious, sort of
it's
like the
in-
general age.
I think it's the early aughts. I don't think it's actually 2000 now that I say that. The original published dates were 2006, 2008.
2006, 2008. Okay, cool.
Yeah, Superman has new powers in this. He has a moment where he gives Lois Lane his powers, and that's his birthday present to her, is to be able to experience what it's like to be him for a day. And he truly loves Lois in this story. There's also something that's a really interesting visual element that I love, is that Frank Quitely and Grant Morrison sat down and said, how the hell do we distinguish Clark Kent from Superman? So they actually developed a visual language where, because, Superman's intelligence, he takes the time to change his posture and change his physicality. So Clark isn't just, Superman with glasses and his hair mussed up a little bit.
Keep going. Keep explaining. This is for somebody that I had to make a point to.
So, and I'll bring, since this is the Absolute Edition, it has all this supplementary material, and he hunches forward, he curves his back, he pigeon toes himself. So what they postulated was that Kent is this giant farm boy in a world that is too small for him. So he's this 6 foot tall giant who's used to being in open space, trying to live in a metropolis. So he's bumping into people all the time. He's tripping over himself because he doesn't fit in that world.
Well, I'd like to point out the thing is with Superman is he literally hides in plain sight the entire time because who's gonna think yeah, he looks like Superman, that's cool, but how can somebody so mousy
Clark?
Yeah.
Superman.
Yeah.
And it's just a way of drawing
Not
the character.
mousy, but who's so not confident in himself, who's so drawn in and hunched over into himself. How can this be Superman? Like who? You're gonna overlook things like that. Most people normally.
It's pretty beat up.
Like most, who you overlook that stuff all the time. And that's what no one realizes. And like, it's just Superman glasses. I'm like, Clark Kent is an entire character in himself.
Well, and it's Clark Kent is the character that he had to build, and so they actually do the dichotomy element with Lois, where he says, "Hey, I'm Superman," and Lois goes, "Yeah, that's hilarious." You're not Superman.
Exactly, and that's the point.
Clark, you're cute. Like that's kind of like the relationship they have. But he's like, no, I need to show you all these things, and she thinks it's a put on. She thinks that Superman and Clark got together and did a little joke with her. So yeah, but really the core element of this book is the fact that you're dealing with how does Superman react to knowing that he's going to die. And there's
basically,
and I can't show a lot of the stuff. Like once again, like the camera not being what it is.
Yeah.
The way that they've designed Superman in this is pretty classic. He has the cape that barely goes past his knees.
He's got the forehead curl.
He's got the forehead curl with the slick back hair. Like it's this. When I think of Superman, and I want people to read something that says, you don't like Superman? Read All Star. Tell me now that you don't like Superman.
Thank you.
Well, Interesting.
Maybe a conversation for a later time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Well,
All right, I'm ready to do that.
trying to avoid shade here. What do you have next for us, Cam?
So the other, I'm just kind of going down my stack because I didn't really put these in order. So continuing our Alan Moore stuff. This is my, I've had this copy of this book since I was in high school. It's got like all of my little bookmarks in it
Oh,
from
nice.
like old high school paper. And
God, I wish I was a better nerd when I was in high school.
look, and it's hardback, and I loved it so much.
That old DC
It's
logo
got the
again.
DC
Super
logo.
old
Oh,
DC
wow.
logo. Right. I loved it so much. I put it in contact paper, which you're totally not supposed to do, and I was so careful about it. I'm such a nerd.
Oh.
The
Wait,
love
you're a
and
nerd?
I-
Okay, you can't be here.
I'll show myself out.
Yeah.
Good job. I'm proud of you.
So who's the artist on this? Because that's I think something that
David
gets
Lloyd.
overlooked.
This is-
People don't talk about the
This
artist.
is you know, Alan Moore in the early '80s working with his Davids,
That's true.
and getting really critically acclaimed.
So why is this one of your top three?
So I did competitive speech when I was in like high school and college, and like the text that Alan Moore writes in here, that's what I have marked in here, right? Are the things like the journal entries and the songs and the poems, and this is where I think this book was instrumental for me in learning that comics can be more than superhero stories, and that comics can really have just incredibly beautiful language in them, and that they can be so much more than the sum of their parts. And you know, the movie was all right. I'm okay with it. You know, it was fine, but I am not one of those people who goes back and like watches the movie every year on the 5th of November. But this is another one of those books that I will just sort of I will pick this up on my bookshelf, and I will find one of my incredibly old
Oh my
like
God.
yellow
Oh,
wave,
wow.
It
That's
is.
amazing.
and I will read it wherever it is, and it makes me happy.
For me, this is like such a small detail of the book, but I actually read it for the first time in 2015.
Mhm.
And there's one panel in it when it's flashing back to the current dictator of England's like campaign, and his campaign slogan is actually "Make Britain Great Again."
Yeesh.
Oh my God, I'm gonna have to look at that again.
Yeah, that is in one panel, and I had to stop and go to the like publishing page just to make sure that it was actually published in the 80s.
Like it wasn't some sort of an edit. Like
Yeah, that I was like, holy shit.
It's so interesting, like to me, and the way that you talked about this is like being an ambassador for comic books, which I think is something important for us as we do this discussion and have this podcast, is to tell people that there's stuff out there for you. Like you don't have to. I'm a Capes and Boots guy. I love that stuff. I'm not by myself, but that's not all I read, and that's not all that's out there.
Well, no,
Like,
I
that's
mean,
and that's important to see. Like this was in the 80s. It's not a new concept
No.
that comic books are for everybody. That there's
I mean,
something. There.
obviously, I'm a pretty big proponent of boots and capes. I mean, Superman is my favorite hero, but one of my top three is The Walking Dead.
Well, and on top of that, one of your top three is a manga, which is culturally.
Yeah.
Japan looks at comics differently than we do here.
Well, and the other thing is too is having it when you
Yes, which we will just mention. There's bits about that in here, about how Japanese is different.
the thing is like just reading them, like it made me delve more into Japanese culture, because the more I delved into their culture, the more I understood another as well. It was very helpful with that as well, just because their schooling is much different, and I was curious about that, so I looked that up. I mean, it also took place in 1998. I was like 6.
And once you get into like anything and this is on a more broad spectrum, but once you get into anything that you really enjoy, whether that be reading comics or maybe like playing the guitar or something like that, it just broadens your knowledge in general, which is why I encourage everybody to not only like broaden their horizons of reading, but just broaden your own horizons in general.
Well,
Because
considering-
you'll become a better,
considering
more
I
well-rounded person.
Never have time for anything, and doing this podcast does help me read. Like, I can honestly say, like, for me, I'm so exhausted all the time, so I watch TV a lot, and it makes me feel like I'm basically losing IQ points at this point. But reading, like, Batman White Knight, it's changed my opinions on many things. It's opened my eyes to many things. I mean, it's really weird how sometimes they translate issues in real life into comics and we don't realize it until you're like, oh, hey, I'm thinking about this on a deeper level. Sometimes comics are yes for pleasure, and that's one of the reasons why I read them, because that's like, that's all I really want. But things like White Knight, things like understanding comics, The Walking Dead, it just shows more personable things, so it's easy to do.
Well, we had a wonderful moment just
Yeah.
now, but we should probably move on. So,
Yeah, right.
Patrick.
So we kind of talked about getting people into comics. So this is a little like origin story for me, and an origin story for my favorite superhero, Miss Marvel. So this was actually the first like quote traditional like superhero story I ever read, and this is what got me into superhero comics only about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. So like I'm here doing all this stuff, but like you can always get into it. There's never a late time to do it. This is also the first time I went to Griffin Games and Comics. I ordered this online, like any good college student did, because this was actually for a college class, and I went immediately after that class to Griffin Games and Comics to request all of the Miss Marvel volumes available currently. So this for me is this showed me that you could have the deep thematic statements of the books that I like to read traditionally in a punch the bad guy kind of superhero
Punch the bad guy in
story.
the face.
Because her superpower is basically to make her fist into a giant fist and punch someone.
That's great.
But the first issue of this just blew me away, honestly. It has one of my favorite quotes from all of comics in the beginning. One of the other characters, Zoe, is talking to Miss Marvel's friend Nakia about her headscarf, and she's like, "Oh, does your dad make you wear it?" And Nakia replies, "Actually, my dad wants me to take it off. He thinks it's a phase." And Zoe replies, "Really? Wow, cultures are so interesting." And then just transitions into something completely different. I just love that.
Zoe is hilarious.
Just-
in there.
Cultures are so interesting.
Yeah.
Cultures are so
God,
interesting.
that's so
And then
amazing.
yeah. And then there's also a line in the first issue where she's like, "I have a better chance of becoming blonde than a superhero," which, funny enough, once she goes through Terrigenesis, she becomes a blonde superhero. So
we don't have more fun or
so Miss Marvel can transform her body. One of her superpowers includes like shape-shifting, basically. And so she goes around initially and fights crime as classic Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers. And but it's like this is like such a good thematic statement in this book that using this power of transformation weakens her other abilities, and so by literally not being herself, she is being a worse version of herself that she can be. And so she ends up getting shot and has to like transform back to heal herself, basically. And for like the rest of the run that it's been out for almost 3 years at this point, she doesn't use her shape-shifting powers. I think in other comics I've seen her use it, other runs, not by G. Willow Wilson, who, I love you, G. Willow Wilson. I love you so much.
I was wondering when you were going to get to the right
Yes, and I
But not in a
believe...
creepy way.
Yeah, not in a creepy way, in
Maybe
a
a
way
little
that's
creepy.
like, can we please have a 10-hour coffee date one day?
So a little creepy.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
adoration. It's
yeah.
Yeah, it's a
I
little
think-
creepy.
Like
So-
one of my favorite things about that book is that like her family and her friends they're so well characterized.
And they're just
Her
family
family
and
is
friends.
Awesome.
Yeah, her dad and her mom are just like so great, and she doesn't have a my parents were killed and now I fight crime.
She's
And
totally
she just
she's
has-
just a kid.
She
You know what?
writes
I'm just gonna start. Like,
she
I'm gonna put a
writes
headlamp
fanfic.
out, and then we can just
She
hit
writes-
people with light for shade.
she
Like,
writes she writes superhero fanfic. She
Really?
she does
Yeah,
That's
actually.
a really interesting to a character.
Yeah,
Right.
there's a great issue of, I believe it's the Avengers annual when she was in the Avengers, and it's all done through fanfic. It's actually, and it turns out in the end that also Phil Coulson is a big fanfic author.
That doesn't
Um,
surprise me at all.
Yeah, I know, right? So, but yeah, she just has like a normal family, and they're all so great, and they all progress so well, and just the characterization is done amazingly. And I believe one of the first villains she fights is like kidnapping millennials, and is basically using. So at first, when I was like, oh, Muslim superhero, I was expecting like a Muslim thematic statement about like that. But this is about everything that Miss Marvel is, and the first arc is about her being a millennial, and that G. Willow talks about this in her TED Talk, which is an amazing TED Talk, by the way, and about how like millennials are just trashed on all the time, and it's just because older generations always hate younger generations, and that doesn't make them worse or better, but what it does is make them feel like shit. And so once that happens, then you can easily come in and convince them of an evil mentality that would get them away from their society in general. And I think that's I love you so much, G. Willow. I have all of your novels sitting on my bookshelf right now too, and so
And-
good.
And just for me, who does the art?
Oh, it's Alfona.
I just read your shirt and it upset me.
It's Adrian Alfona, is it? And then I believe Takeshi
Miyazawa.
Yes, thank you. Takes over after Adrian. So
I'm just gonna throw in like one other perspective on Ms. Marvel because I have a kid, and something that is very common in stuff that can be read by kids or like in all ages is to assume that the character has to have like this horrific god awful backstory
yeah.
in order to
My
be interesting,
parents.
right? You know, something tragic and horrible
Oh,
has
man,
to happen
this
to
thing.
them to make them interesting. And that's something that I also, that this is going to sound stupid. Okay, my daughter is 4. She watches Doc McStuffins. And one of the things that I like about Ms. Marvel and Doc McStuffins is that, I mean, she's relatively normal. She's nice to her parents. Her friends are great. And it's just not even a thing.
That's cool.
Right? It's just she's just being her, and she's not a jerk to anyone else. Her friends, for the most part, right, like her, and they have like their own motivations, and they're interesting.
See, this is the thing is like, I mean, I understand that to a point too, but there's also, oh god, Superman is something I aspire to, and I also think that sometimes we need things to aspire to. Even
I
if
aspire to be Miss Marvel.
That's fair.
It still
If you
works.
read Miss Marvel, she stands for truth and justice and everything that is good and like the American dream and all these good
Wait,
things.
what?
No, I know, right? But she's basically like Superman in her mentality. She's like if Superman was like a teenage geek, basically. And
Alright, we'll
Yeah.
save that for later.
so we'll say that for later. But
Conversations.
it's a similar
Oh my god,
mentality.
someone just walked by the window wearing your shirt.
That's cool.
My shirt?
Wearing, yes.
That's time
it was
travel.
a sweatshirt.
We were talking about
Yeah,
paper
that
girls
was
earlier.
really
Yeah,
so-
alright,
Yeah.
that's what really. It's apparently Patrick has.
Right,
mine.
exactly.
Well,
Okay.
I mean, it definitely wasn't Patrick.
Am
So
I here?
I'm going to say this. Unfortunately, we are running long on time, so we're going to rush a little bit through the next, the final ones, which is counterintuitive because we should spend more time.
Yeah.
But
Well, the final one, mine's not that difficult to get through, and it's a semi-easy conversation. So my favorite, and it's I like cutesy things so much, especially in manga. I love cutesy manga. I love it. I just love it. Like I read one about Disney princesses. Anyways, so my favorite one is called Girlfriends. Like they're 2 words. And it's the complete collection, volume 2, and this is kind of where we run into that issue with manga, where it's the complete story ends up in 2. I like the second half more because it actually delves more into things. So it ends up being volumes 3 through number 5. This was actually the first Yuri manga that I've ever read, and if you don't know what Yuri is, it's pretty simple. It's, if you know, yaoi is boy romance, Yuri is girl romance. Makes sense. So this is the second part of the series. The first part of it is there are these 2 girls, they meet, and the biggest thing to a lot of the Yuri mangas that you read is, I have these weird feelings, but they're just friend feelings, right? Because she's a girl and I can't feel that way. So for me, it's one of those things of when I was younger, that's a lot of what I struggled with is she's a girl. You can't feel that way. That's not right. That's not correct. That's not what you're supposed to do. And of course, I grew up in that time frame of that's not what you're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's my biggest thing is I don't like things that are over sexualized because it's just not. It's not my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this one isn't over sexualized. It is for a more mature audience. I'm not saying if you're 12 you need to go read this, but if you're like 16, 17, go for it. Smaller children, no.
Interesting. So it's your favorite because of those themes of like girlfriends, and then also.
Well, the thing is they.
Stuff.
Yeah, that's it. The thing is what it comes down to is they end up being friends, like really, really close friends, and the both of them can't understand that it's more than a friendship, and neither of them realizes it. And I actually dealt with this when I was younger. Is I had a friend, and we were both growing up, and we were both gay, and we didn't understand it.
Interesting.
And so with these 2, they're both in a world where they can't do this because it's not normal. It's not normal. It's not right. So it's a lot of back and forth with that, and that's where they come into issues. And it seems silly, but it's not over sexualized. It's very romantic. They do very interesting. It's really cute. And for me, it was just a really good series, just in that fact of it brought me back to that point when I was like 13, 14, and I didn't understand what was going on with me. And it made me feel okay because that is normal. That does happen to everybody. So, yeah. Read the first one first, because if you just pick up the second one, it doesn't make sense. We'll start with that, but the second one is my favorite because then you actually see them get where they need to be.
Interesting. Well, with that said, what do you got for us?
I have something a lot less emotional and heartfelt. I've got Bone. The 1 volume edition, The Way Bones Should Be Read.
Yeah.
Black and white.
Nobody upset Nat today, man. You're gonna get hit.
Yeah. This is the perfect example for me of why you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. I have a story, 7th grade. My buddy was talking to me about his comic books that he liked, and he was drawing pictures of a phone bone. And
he's adorable.
Well, and I thought myself above that, being a superhero comic reader, and I was reading Spawn because I was cool.
We're also cool here.
When I was in art school, I discovered and reread this read this for the first time. And my life was changed forever. I was changed as an artist. I was understanding the brushstroke, understanding the broad strokes of storytelling, and how you can use elements as an entry point for a bigger world. And I think that for me, I'm actually, like, after you're talking, I'm getting emotional thinking about like what the book means to me now. And it's just like,
yeah, it's kind of sucks, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
right.
It's cartoons in the best form. It's like, I know I'm getting pretty teary-eyed actually just thinking about like it's Lord of the Rings meets Donald Duck meets, like, it's,
So why don't you give us? I know it's like the biggest book ever. It makes the Walking Dead compendium look like a one issue.
right.
But why don't you give
Yeah.
us a quick.
So the
synopsis?
Bone Cousins, who literally are like cartoon characters, arrive in the
They
valley.
look like bones.
They look like little like bulbous bone things, but they arrive in the valley sort of by accident and just want to
They're
try to go back
basically
home.
noses with feet.
Yeah. They were kind of ostracized in their city because of what one of them did, and then during his mayoral campaign, and they fall into a world that turns out to be full of magic and history and have to be heroes in their own way.
Dragons.
Dragons,
Dragons.
lots of
Lots of
talking animals.
dragons.
and like I said, it's basically this is Uncle Scrooge and the oh my god, I can't the cousins.
The duckling.
The
The
Huey,
nephews.
Dewey,
the
and
nephews,
Louie.
yeah, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, and they fall into the Lord of the Rings. I mean, that's the best way I can describe it, and it's just so magical, and there's
And
so much.
It's basically like a classic Greek. Like it's like the Iliad and the Odyssey
Yeah.
combined into like a Lord of the Rings-esque fantasy tale.
And then these
With
beautiful.
some Moby Dick thrown in.
Oh,
on
yes.
the
with
side.
Moby Dick.
Moby Dick.
Jeff Smith. I'm sorry, I can't believe I let that out. Jeff Smith, the sole creator. Jeff Smith and
Totally forgot about my author too.
I
You're
think
fine.
his wife Viasia, who quit her job and helped him publish this and get all of the pieces together. This is what is representative of an absolute labor of love. This is when somebody says, "Oh, I don't know what I should read," and they've already started dipping into comics and say, "You need Bone. Bone needs to be in your collection," and my hand hurts from holding it up that high. So, yeah.
Hurrah!
Bone. Anyway, what do you got for us next, Cam?
I'm continuing in my vein of like critical acclaim. I got Mouse.
Ooh.
Because Mouse was another one that changed how I read comics and what I could expect from comics. Mouse, I talk about how we've talked about this with Watchmen, right? How the art looks very dated.
Mhm.
Mouse does not, because it is, it's past. It's hello, look, concentration camps.
Dive into the deep.
Yeah.
Yes, that was not my intention. But I mean, it still looks very clean.
Mhm.
You know, the style is, it's just, it is so much more than a comic book. And this is, when people say to me things like, I don't read comics. They're just comics. This is right. This is a book that
It's
you
like
can
a trigger word,
Yes.
trigger statement.
and you can say, hey, look, Pulitzer Prize winning.
Yeah.
And
I guess
this,
a lot of this at this point is just letting people know comics are literature.
yes,
Yeah.
this will wreck you. Like if you have not read it and you go through.
For the uninitiated,
I
what is Mouse about?
Yeah.
It is about the Holocaust. It is.
That's why it will wreck you.
Completely.
I
It takes place like in concentration
I
camps.
think one of the most interesting parts about this story is it is both a memoir and a biography
Yes.
at the same time.
Yes.
Oh,
And there
that
are
idea is rough.
Mhm.
there are things in here
I feel like we're
that
destroying ourselves slowly right now.
that you would. I mean, there's a lot of comics even that you can read that you would go, you know what, that could have been done as prose.
Right.
This could be adapted into prose and it would still be good. There are things in here which he conveyed through comics which could not have been conveyed through prose.
I recently reread it. I actually just finished it like 2
This
days
is by
ago.
Art Spiegelman, by the way.
Art
and he's
Spiegelman.
amazing.
Yes, and there's one scene in it where it's talking about the gas chambers and how they use basically like insect like pesticide in it, and then like at the end of that chapter there's like flies flying around and he's spraying insects with insect killer,
Yes.
and he's like, I don't know how anybody can do that stuff, and
Yeah.
then just so good.
Yeah, there are. It's amazing. I'll just yes, it's amazing.
Yes, Art Spiegelman the premise is Art Spiegelman is interviewing his father, who is a Holocaust survivor, if we didn't say that already.
Yeah, and there's so many, like, I mean, there you can see the generational tension in there, and how there's things that even having lived through the Holocaust and having these experiences, there's ways that he thinks that the son looks on and goes, ooh, that's not right.
Wow.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's so well done.
Yes, for reading.
Yay.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Patrick, sending us home.
Sending us home with. I'm gonna keep ramping up the emotion on this. So my number one, I don't actually have an issue or a copy of it with me right here, is American Born Chinese by Jean Luen Yang.
Oh,
He
God,
does
no.
the author. He's the author and illustrator. So this is such a short read. I read it in 2 hours, and I'm a super slow reader. It is 3 parallel stories. Well, not parallel at all, actually. It doesn't become clear until the end why they're even together in the same book. So it starts off with Sun Wukong, I can't read my own writing, actually, who is the Monkey King from The Journey of the East, basically.
Oh, okay.
And his story about, A Journey to the West, excuse me. And it's his story about how he tries to basically better himself and become a god, and gets crushed by his attempts literally under a giant pile of rocks at the end. Yeah, and the next story is a second generation Chinese immigrant, Jin Wang. Jean Luen Yang may or may not have inspired this character.
Yeah.
He comes to an elementary school and tries to fit in. Basically tries to be an American boy, like date a white girl, and there's only one other Chinese kid in his class who's like from China himself, like speaks in an accent and does all this stuff, and the Chinese kid keeps trying to get Jin to like be his friend, but he's like kind of trying to push that off, like trying to not accept his culture basically to fit in with the new culture in America. And the last story is I forget the sort of American's name, but this white American, his cousin Chin Ki, little wordplay right there, moves in a super stereotypical like sitcom sort of like a Crocodile Dundee kind of, what am I trying to say? Like a fish out of water.
Oh, okay,
sitcom,
yeah.
Basically. I
What?
know, right?
We're living in
I was
Australia.
like, where are we going with this?
There's like jokes about Chinese stereotypes, like the way he dresses. He like moves in and all of his luggage is in like takeout boxes, like giant takeout boxes. And some of it is like in the beginning of
I feel like a
that,
horrible human
in the
being
beginning
right
of
now.
that story arc, it's like generally funny. Like some of it is actually like just so ridiculous that it's funny. And there's actually like a laugh track going across the bottom of it too. As that particular story progresses, the laughing is not funny. The laughing makes your heart hurt. It is laughing at them, not laughing with them. And it is crazy. So in the end, it turns out that Danny, the white kid, that's his name, the white kid who is Chinky's cousin, is actually Jin Wang, who completely threw off his Chinese nature and actually became a white person. And it turns out that Chin Ki is actually the Monkey King, here to remind Danny, aka Jin, about his like actual like Chinese nature, like his culture and heritage. Yes, thank you. I forgot those words for a second right there. And this book was so moving to me. One of my best friends in high school is Japanese. Jacob, if you're listening, I love you so much. And I was frankly a dick to him when I first met, like in middle school. And I read this, and I knew, and I thought about this. I knew what I did like was very wrong, and like I read this, like, and I was able to actually like put it like what I did into specific like thoughts. And I called him and I cried to him for like probably like 30 minutes. And he was just like, yeah, okay.
Patrick's not trying to have a moment.
I'm such a bad person. I'm such a dick. Like, how could you ever like have been my friend after what I did to you? And he's just like,
It's awesome.
yeah, it's good to talk to you too. We haven't talked to him. Like, oh God, I love you so much, Jacob. So this is such a powerful
Unreal
book.
friendship.
Such a powerful book in such a short amount of time. Just amazing. Gene Yang killing it in the comics game. Absolutely killing it. So.
Well,
I'm not emotional high now.
Right, I know.
Right.
Let's say thank you to Kim for
Yes.
being here.
Thank you, Kim.
I appreciate you.
And hopefully that was apparently insightful.
Yeah, you
That
have to
was-
saw a part of us that we all attempt to hide sometimes,
Yeah.
apparently.
So yeah,
We got a little personal.
that's our treat
Yeah.
picks.
That being said,
Yeah.
comics are great.
Let us know if you read any of them and what you
Yeah.
think. I'm just saying, I wouldn't be
Are we
offended.
totally off base?
You're allowed to call me out.
Yeah.
Not
All right.
allowed to call me out. I'll never. Do
You can find Kim to call her out at Griffin Games and
Yeah.
Comics.
You can go directly to her.
Anyway,
I'll read
Alright,
your
so
comments.
that being said, why don't we say bye?
Bye.